ISO 9001-2015, Clause 41, 42, and 61 tell us we should be aware of and manage the risk in our business. Assessing risk and developing a plan to manage it is part of the plan phase of the plan, do, check, act cycle of a quality management system. Hello everyone, I'm Jim Johnstone from Johnstone Global Consulting, and today I'm going to show you how to assess your risk and prioritize them, and then we're going to discuss risk mitigation or management strategies. There are several ways to evaluate risk. Some of you may use the strength, weaknesses, opportunity, threat type of analysis, or SWOT. SWOT is a qualitative analysis technique, and the criteria are not always clear. But I like to use the PFMEA analysis because it's easy to turn it into a risk priority number that we can use to set priorities. The drawback is that it's more difficult and complex, and it takes a little bit more effort because you look at things more systematically. Let's start by defining exactly what is a supply chain. It's all the elements involved in supplying what you need to produce your product or services from Mother Earth all the way to your customer. And that includes materials, transportation, information, and the means of transforming the material into product and services, and the skilled people that do all of that. Assessing the risk in every element of the supply chain is a daunting task and requires more resources than you have. So you've got to prioritize things. Even after you narrow down the scope to just you and your first and second tier suppliers, it's still going to be a large task. Well, let's get started. The first thing we want to look at is which elements in the supply chain should we consider for having risk. Now, if you look at some of your parts, like on your bill of materials, commodities like fasteners, for example, are easily replaceable. They're usually not capacity constrained. It's easy to tell if they're good or bad, and generally they present a very low risk. So let's not put them on our list of parts to examine. Parts which are easily replaceable because there's no special technology or know-how required to manufacture them, and that have very short lead times, may be grouped into families so that you can make general assessments of the risk and have a more generic plan. And then there are parts which uniquely determine the function and features of your product that are hard to functionally test until they're integrated into the system, or that have a very long lead time, and those are the ones we want to give more specific attention to. What is risk when we're talking about supply chains? Risk in your supply chain is the probability that you will not get everything that you want during a specified time period. For purposes of our presentation today, let's think about a 1-year time period. So what's the probability that you will not get what you expect from your suppliers during the next year? And we'll evaluate that on a supplier by supplier basis. So what are the things that you want from your supply chain? You want to get the right part in the right quantity at the right time, and you want it to conform to your requirements. Requirements include both written and implied requirements, and that regards form, fit, function, packaging, labeling, reliability, any data that you might require, and cost. So some of this data that you already have because you're collecting it on your suppliers. So usually every supplier, you keep track of what the quality level is, what the accuracy is on the parts delivered, how many, the count. If you ordered 100, did you get 100? And then how late are they on delivery, or early are they on the delivery? You can look in your MRP system, usually find this data, your quality management system. This is where you're going to find the records on how suppliers have performed for you in the past. How shall we approach our risk assessment task? Let's do it on a supplier by supplier basis. Let's look at suppliers who supply critical parts or services to us in order of dollars spent. Say the top 80% of our total spend. A critical part or service is something that defines the utility of our product or could have a disastrous impact on the customer if it failed. Now let's take a look at some of the risks in the supply chain. Here's 7 categories of risk that we should be able to evaluate. What are the business capabilities of the supplier? What are the financial risks that they take? What are their quality or technical risks? How about labor? Will they have enough labor? Is it a union shop or are they ununionized? Are there some logistical risk? How many borders do we have to cross to get that part from wherever it's made to our factory and then back out to the supplier? What about geopolitical risks? Is that country that part is made in a stable country? Or are there some uncertainties there about whether things are going to continue as they are or perhaps change and affect the supply of parts to you? And then we always have the geophysical risk. Right now they're having fires in California, floods in Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico. And these are some of the geophysical risks that we need to look at that may interrupt the supply of parts or services to us. First thing we want to know about a supplier is, do they have the capacity to do what we're asking them to do? Do they have the technical equipment? Do they have the technical know-how to do it? If inventory is required, do they have a safe place to store that inventory? Let me tell you a story about a supplier. This was a division of a large multinational contract manufacturer. They had bid on a large assembly for the company that I was working for at the time. This assembly consisted of a weldment, a couple of robots that were installed into this welded frame. They had sheet metal. They had to construct a HEPA filter assembly that went on the top. And then they had to do all the wiring and the signal and power wiring for this assembly. When it was all done, they had to test it and assure that it met my capability requirements. Well, they didn't have a paint booth big enough to paint the frame once it was welded up. The frame also required some machining on it to hold the precision that we needed for the datums. They didn't have a machining center that was large enough to accept the frame and do the machining that was required. Not only didn't they have a machining center to do that, there was nobody within 100 miles of them that had a machining center big enough to do that. And finally, they hadn't even begun to build the facility that they needed to assemble this subassembly for me inside of a clean room. So luckily we visited them, discovered all this, and then got them to expedite solutions to every one of those problems. Otherwise, we would have been dead in the water when it came time for them to start up. So look at your supplier's ability to do what you're asking them to do. Do they have the technical and managerial capability to get it done? Look at what they're going to do when they run out of capacity. Everybody runs out of capacity sooner or later. Sometimes it's because they have orders. Maybe you're increasing your order on them. Maybe other customers are increasing their orders. What are they going to do when they run out of capacity? Do they run out because they don't have the labor, the tooling, or the space to get it done? How long does it take them to solve each one of those problems? Those are key elements in determining the risk that you have that you're going to run out of supply from that supplier. Look at their business management techniques. Do they know how much inventory they have? Are their inventory records accurate? Can they verify that? How often do they turn the inventory? Do they have a lot of cash tied up in their inventory, or are they turning it over quite often and moving it through the business? How do they manage their suppliers? Are there any special process suppliers that they have to manage? People that do things like apply paint or coatings, plating, supply special features like ceramics. Maybe it's a ceramic coating things that normally that supplier wouldn't do, but they need to manage a supplier that serves them and provides that service. What kind of computer and communication infrastructure do they have? Do they have enough computing power to manage the business and manage it well? And are they able to communicate with you over the internet or telephone lines? Finally, look at the integrity of the owners of the business and the managers of the business. Are they people you can trust? You can find that out by talking to the employees of the business and talking to the suppliers of that supplier. Well, what we need is a systematic way to record all of these risks. So I've created these tables. Here's a business risk assessment table. It's going to look at 6 different elements: capacity, technology, business management, supply chain management, computer and communication infrastructure, and overall business integrity. You're going to rank each one of these as either a low risk, medium risk, or high risk, and you're going to use criteria that you and your team decide are important to you in your business. What's important to me may be one thing, what's important to you may be something different. It's best to work together with purchasing, design, or manufacturing engineering, and then the manufacturing management when you're assessing these risks. Each one of those are going to have a different point of view as to what constitutes a risk. So working together, you can develop the criteria that you want to use to rank each one of these categories in terms of its risk to you. Business is tough, and it requires financial risk-taking. You want to make sure your supplier has sufficient capital and cash and access to credit so that they can stay in business. There's going to be ups and downs in business. Sales will come, sales will go, and you need that supplier to be able to weather all of that. Look at their balance sheet, look at their inventory positions, look at your own business practices on forecasting, ordering, and payment, and try to understand the stress that your business is going to put on this supplier. Are they already behind on payments to their suppliers? Are they being sued by someone? Are they current on all of their loans? Look at your forecasted demands as a percent of their total revenue. If your forecasted demand is more than 50% of their total revenue, that's a red flag. I'm not saying don't place the order. I'm saying be careful what you're doing and be aware of the risk that you're taking. Look at their upstream suppliers. Sometimes it's not your supplier that causes the supply chain to fail. It's the tier 2 supplier that's supplying your supplier. How does your supplier monitor his or her suppliers? So once you've visited your supplier, your purchasing agent should be able to help you make this assessment on the financial risk with the supplier based on visits and the interactions with the supplier. Then you can assess the risk and just stick with low, medium, or high. And you can look at things like third-party ratings of the creditworthiness, like a Dun & Bradstreet report. You can look and see if they own or lease their real estate and their equipment. Have they been deferring maintenance on the facility or on their equipment? What is their inventory accuracy and how well do they control it? Do they have excess and obsolete inventory laying around? And at the end of the day, give everything low, medium, high, and then look at your total risk situation. Now let's take a look at the quality and technical risk. If you've done business with a supplier before, you probably have a pretty good handle on their ability to deliver products that meet your technical requirements. If you haven't done business with a supplier, take a look at their quality management system. Many small companies do not even have one. They just have a quality person or maybe just inspectors. I would be looking for ISO 9001 as a minimum and investigate to see if they are following their processes. Do they audit what they're doing? What do their audit results say? How do they manage quality? Is it part of their business process? Do they set quality goals? Are they continuously improving? And what internal and external feedback systems do they have? How do they measure their internal processes? Do they track scrap, yield, discrepant material reports? Do they have a corrective action, preventive action program? Do they know how to determine root cause and communicate that back to the customer? How do they manage their suppliers? Do they constantly monitor and measure? Do they have goals for their suppliers for on-time delivery and quality? Do they understand their measurement system capability? Do they understand process capability? Are they using statistical process control? How about their test and measurement systems? Are they compared and correlated to their customers' measurement systems? These are all things that help you assess the risk of your supplier, and you have to do this by visiting the supplier. Okay, you've been out to the supplier, you've assessed their quality and technical risk. Now you've got to set some criteria for what low, medium, and high is. So let's first take a look at the quality management system, or QMS. If a supplier doesn't even have 9001 certification, I'm going to rank them as a high-risk candidate. If they have it, I'm going to give them at least a medium. And if they have 9001 certification and they're having frequent management reviews of their progress towards their quality goals, and they're making good progress, I'm going to rank them as low. On percent defective, compare that to your other suppliers and put them low if they're low relative to the type of product that you're comparing. You get the idea. Now you've got to establish your own criteria and decide if each supplier is high, medium, or low risk to you. There's always a risk of running out of labor to get the job done. So when you go visit your supplier, you want to find out if they're a union shop or if they're ununionized. If they are a union shop, how long to the next contract expiration, and what's been their past history of strikes? Whether they're union or not, go talk to HR and find out what the turnover rate is. Why are people leaving? If people are leaving, how hard is it to hire replacement labor? Is there a shortage of skilled labor in that supplier's area? How about their pay and benefits relative to average for the area? Most small suppliers are really trying to pay less than average for the skills that they hire. They just can't compete with large multinational corporations. Look at population growth. If population is leaving the area where your supplier is, they're going to have a harder time recruiting and hiring people. If population is increasing, it'll be easier for them to hire and recruit people. Finally, take a look at your confidence in management. Do you believe what management is telling you? How about their employees? Do they have confidence in the management? Talk to them and find out what they think about their top management. Here's the matrix for risk of a long-term labor shortage. I've filled in the columns with criteria for low, medium, and high. These are the criteria that I would use. What you might want to use could be different. Now, one way to use this would be to get a column total and give yourself -1 for each answer in the low risk column where you checked low risk. Give yourself a 0 for any answer in the medium column, and give yourself +1 for any answer in the high risk column. When you're all done, get the total of all three columns, and if you find the total is somewhere between -10 to -6, I would say your risk is low. If your total for all three columns is in the range -5 to +3, that's a moderate risk. And if your total is +3 or above, or you have 4 or more answers in the high risk column, then you're definitely at high risk for a labor shortage. Next, let's evaluate the logistical risk. Logistical risks are determined by how far away the supplier is, what kind of transportation mode that you're using to get the product from them to you, how that product is handled, and then you've got to look at information system disruptions. If your supplier doesn't get the order, they're not going to fill the order. So look at how well the information systems work between you and your supplier. Suppliers can use all kinds of modes of transportation. You've got land, sea, air. Land could be truck or rail, or fast runner in tennis shoes. Sea transportation generally is going to take you, if you're importing things to the U.S. from the United States, probably going to take you 30 to 40 days to get those products from your supplier to you. When you have that much time in your pipeline, you don't have time to discover that they've done something wrong and it needs to get corrected. You've now got 40 days of inventory in the pipeline that has to be corrected. That supplier's not near you. It's hard for them to correct it at your point of use. So you might have to fly them to your shop, put them up where they can do the correction. You might have to send that inventory back to get it corrected. You have to determine how you're going to solve any of those problems should they come up and assign that the appropriate risk. No problem, you say, I'm shipping by air. Well, a lot of times air cargo sits on the tarmac waiting to be loaded. And while it's sitting there, it gets rained on, gets moved around, can be pilfered. So you do have a loss risk factor at the airport. Also, product can get bumped off of airplanes. Some customers pay for priority shipping, which means they get to go first. They need to go, they go, your freight sits. So be careful on mode of transportation. Be careful by having suppliers that are far away with long pipelines into you. Then we have information system disruptions. You know, there's all kinds of hacking going on around the world. Sony has been hacked. Equifax has been hacked. JP Morgan, Chase and Company have been hacked. A lot of companies are hacked or held ransom by cyber attack. Who's responsible for the package design? Usually small suppliers are not capable or proficient in designing packaging, so they have to hire that out. Who does it for them? Does your packaging have to meet any specifications or standards? Where's the supplier going to get the expertise to not only design the package, but get it tested? Are you using any hazardous material that has to be labeled or protected? Is the packaging designed for the handling that it's going to see in the pipeline before it gets to you? These are all questions you need to ask of your supplier and of your engineering team. Here's our logistical risk summary page, our matrix. While you're looking at that, I want to tell you a story about a part that I had when I was working for Applied Materials. Originated in China as a machined part, then was sent on to Japan for specialized ceramic coating. Then left Japan and came to California, where it was put into a subassembly. And finally, from the California supplier, it was forwarded on to me in Austin, Texas, where our factory assembled it into a final system. So we had 2 border crossings. We had 3 logistical legs to traverse. And we were dealing with 3 different cultures from around the world. The supply chain for this was terrible. It was the worst design I could possibly think of. And as a consequence, our supply wasn't very fluid on this part. So finally, I assigned one of my engineers to shepherd it. And I said, every day, you're going to have a meeting with the 3 sub-tier suppliers. You're going to go over what is the inventory in each part of the pipeline, what were the shipments that day, what were the receipts that day, and what was the yield at every step of the operation. So we started that, and within about 2 weeks, that flow smoothed right out. We started to get a predictable flow into our factory in Austin. Still wasn't as much as we needed, but at least we knew where the problems were now, which step was causing us the problems. We then dispatched our special process engineers to work with the suppliers that were having the difficulty. They were able to help them clean up their processes and have a more predictable yield and a more predictable final shipment into our factory in Austin. So distance creates problems just in the communication of information and in managing the flow of the pipeline. Geopolitical risks are not something we really think too much about if we're only doing business in one country. But if you're doing business across borders, then you need to be aware of the government regulations in the country that is supplying you or the country that you're supplying, as well as in your own country. It's good to have a good, well-rounded customs broker to help you through those regulations. You also need to be worried if you're getting a supply from a country that's politically unstable or that's politically corrupt, where the officials expect bribes to get things done. And you've got to watch out for your intellectual property. It could be being leaked out and given to other people's to come back and compete with you. How do you find out? Well, I'll show you. There's a thing called the Global Peace Index. It's published by the Institute for Economics and Peace. And as you can see on this chart, they have already prioritized the risk for you by color. So we see that the darker green has lots of peace. You gotta love Canada here. It looks like a very peaceful place to live. And here's the US, moderate. The index gauges global peace using three broad themes. What's the level of safety and security in society? Secondly, what is the extent of domestic and international conflict? And third, what is the degree of militarization? Now, the reason the United States shows up yellow is because we have a high degree of militarization and we're always involved in some kind of international conflict. So factors are both internal, such as the levels of violence and crime within the country, and external, such as military expenditures and wars. And here is the rest of the world, and the source for this is the Institute for Economics and Peace. And the time frame we're talking about, the most recent I was able to find was 2015. So a couple of years old here. But you can see over in the other part of the world, things are a little bit less peaceful than they are in our neck of the woods. Okay, what about our intellectual property? Again, we have the International Property Rights Index, and this comes from the International Property Rights Alliance website. Blue means high protection for property rights, and red is low protection. So you can see here North America is pretty blue, whereas the Far East China is pretty red. Not too much protection for property rights. So be careful what kind of intellectual property you're putting at suppliers in the red zone. You want to see how honest each country is? This is the control of corruption. Source is the Worldbank. And again, they have already ranked each country for us by color in terms of how corrupt they are. Green being less corrupt, red being more corrupt. You can use this to assess the risk of doing business in any particular country in the world. And again, just put it into a high, medium, low kind of a scenario. So here we have our matrix. We can rank each of these four elements: government regulations, government stability, government corruption, and property rights for any one of our suppliers based on where they do business. If you don't know where to get the government regulation information, ask your purchasing agent or your legal department, they can help you with that. We also have risk due to weather. We could have flooding, fires, earthquakes, wind. Floods usually happen at low-lying areas near bodies of water. Just look at the history for the area where your supplier is. Fires are near forest experiencing a drought or hazardous manufacturing storage nearby. So again, you can ask your supplier what's around them, who's in your neighborhood, and you can look and observe to see if they're in a dangerous area that's subject to fires. Earthquakes. There was quite a bit of concern about earthquakes around the Pacific Rim, but now earthquakes could be anywhere with fracking activity, so you should consider anywhere possible for an earthquake. Wind, the east and south coast of the USA seem to get the most wind. The hurricanes, east coast and islands of the Pacific Rim. Tornado Alley is in the Midwest in the USA. And you can get information on this from the U.S. Geological Survey and from other government agencies. And here, courtesy of the U.S. Geological Survey, is the seismicity of the Earth from the years 1900 to 2013, basically as long as they've been keeping records. And all those little red dots represent earthquakes. So you can see where earthquakes have been occurring or likely to occur in the future. And if you want to zoom in, you can see specific areas. This happens to be the San Francisco Bay Area, California. I've centered it over where I used to live in Morgan Hill, Gilroy area of California. And that happened to be right on one of the fault lines. You can see there's two major fault lines that sort of come together there, the San Andreas fault, and then you have the Hayward fault there coming together, which meant we were prone to earthquakes, and we had to take precautions. Everybody knew how to shut off their gas, how to keep their home from sliding off its foundation, and what to do in case of an earthquake. Here's the NOAA map showing the severe weather probability. You can get this from NOAA, a government agency, and they'll be glad to plot this for you. It's available from their website. And red means more probability of severe weather, and then yellow is less probability, and the gray is pretty much fair weather most of the time. So once again, we can go back to our matrix and we can rank each one of these disasters by low, medium, or high for each one of our suppliers based on their geographic area. Okay, now I know what you're thinking. Hey, this is a lot of work, Jim. It's really impractical for me to assess every part or supplier. And that's true. So how extensive should a risk assessment be? Well, it's up to you, but it ought to be adequate to cover your critical parts and services. So which parts are critical? It's those that aren't easily replaced, that are special in design, delivery, or manufacturing technique, or maybe they require a unique relationship between you and the supplier, but they are critical to customer satisfaction. Every part could be critical, but some parts are more easily replaced than others, and there's alternate sources. So let's don't do an extensive risk assessment on those. We can just lump all those together and say they're commodities. Let's focus on our critical or very important unique parts. Okay, this is the payoff slide now. You know, your executives don't want to read a novel to understand the risk in the supply chain. They want you to make it simple for them. This chart is how you do that. You've got 7 areas of risk coming down the left-hand column here: business capability, quality technical, financial, logistical, geopolitical, geophysical, and labor. You have used each one of your individual risk matrices to come up with a number of the probability of occurrence of supply chain interruption due to each one of these factors. If it's low probability, you gave it a low number, 0, 1, 2. If it was high probability, you gave it a high number, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then you added a column to show if that happens, what is the impact on our business or on our customers. High impact, high numbers; low impact, low numbers. In the third column, we want to know how much advance warning do we get. If we can see this coming from a long way off, we'll give it a low number. If it's definitely going to come as a surprise, like an earthquake does, then we're going to give it a high number. We're going to multiply all three of these numbers together to get what's called the risk priority number. Now, this is the same thing you would be doing if you were creating a failure modes and effects analysis for a part that you're making in your factory. So I like to use this FMEA technique because it gives us a very simple way to show to an executive where the risks are. And I've got my arrows here. They should be pointing to the 3 high-risk areas. That was anything around 150 or higher. And in this case, it would be logistical, geophysical, and labor risk. So I could do this for each one of my supplier or each item if I wanted to get that specific. Let's just stick to suppliers for now. Well, so far we've talked about 7 elements of risk in the supply chain. But really there's one more element, and that's you as the customer. You add risk into the supply chain through your business practices and your relationship management with the supplier. If you give poor forecasts to the supplier, chances are they're not going to be able to meet your demand when you want the product. If you're sloppy with your data, especially your quality data, beat up the supplier for things they didn't do, you're introducing risk into the supply chain. So look at your relationship management and your business practices. How do you treat the supplier? How good is the information that you give them? Do you pay them on time? Those are things that can introduce risk into the supply chain from your end. Okay, what can we do to mitigate risk? Frequently, the first thing people think of is, let's carry more inventory. That's called safety stock. Might be the right thing for you to do, but it's expensive. And you know what happens to inventory? It rusts, busts, and it collects dust. So having too much inventory may be not the way to go. You could have more than one supplier for critical items. The problem with having more than one supplier is each supplier is going to produce those critical items slightly differently. And so you're going to have a variation in your product and the way it performs. I could have one supplier but more than one production location. That's better, but doesn't always give me the lowest price. Every supplier should have some kind of a disaster recovery plan, what they're going to do if they get struck by a hurricane or an earthquake. The best form of risk management is to have a very good supplier selection process. Selecting the right supplier in the first place can really reduce your risk. We can also have supplier monitoring and audits to make sure that quality doesn't go out of control or capacity isn't being frittered away. And just monitor the news and the weather so you have advance warning of things that are going to affect your supply chain. Now, in a live webinar, we'd be sharing our real-life experiences at this point. Since we're not live, you're just going to have to do this on your own. But think about some real experiences that you've had where you were able to do something that reduced the risk of supplier running out of capacity, supply chain logistics issues, quality issues, geopolitical or geophysical issues, and what did you do about it, and then what evidence do you have that it actually made a difference? Okay, what can you do with this information now to help your company do a better job of managing risk in the supply chain? Well, the first thing you can do is educate your team. And if you want to look really smart to your team, you should tell them you've got to do a couple of things to make this even possible to get it done at all. One is you have to reduce the scope. It can't be done on every part. You want to separate the trivial from the critical few. So get it down to the few critical parts, the few critical services that make your business go, whatever it is that defines your business. That's what you've got to focus on. The second thing you've got to do is maybe use some group technology. Group things together, either by suppliers in a certain location or all suppliers that make a certain kind of a part. Maybe it's a critical part that is made for you. Identify the risk using the techniques that I've shown you, and then prioritize those risks by assigning the risk priority number, and then systematically reduce the risk on your high-risk areas. Where do you get the information? You're going to have to rely heavily on your own experience. You probably have a lot of data in your own company already that will help you. And then you're going to have to go to financial reporting firms to get information on financial risk, and then government and non-governmental organization agencies that track things like the weather, like the political stability in countries. You can go to the United Nations and then read the newspaper. Or if you don't believe the newspaper, go to Google. Here's an example of an action plan for a geophysical risk. Thailand a few years back had tremendous flooding in the monsoon season, and a device assembly plant was shut down. Your advance warning was only 1 or 2 days, so what are you going to do? Well, the response team plan was, first of all, we're going to consume the inventory that's in the pipeline. It's still coming into me, so I'm going to consume that. And then I'm going to go out and look in any of my stocking locations and pull back into the factory any idle inventory there that I can consume. And I'm going to reschedule my own production to produce alternate models that don't use the product from Thailand. And I'll try to shift device orders to specify alternate sources that don't come from Thailand. Then once the Thai plant is up and running, I'm going to make sure they scale up quickly to recover. The expected impact is we'll probably lose 1 week of Model X, whatever Model X is, that use the Thailand parts production. So ideally you have an action plan for each part in your supply chain, but that's not practical. So fortunately, many parts can use the same action plan, and many parts with their commodities don't need as an extensive an action plan as you see here. Well, that concludes my presentation on how to identify and manage risk in your supply chain. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember, first thing is reduce the scope. It's not everything that happens everywhere in your supply chain. It's those critical few things that are very important to you. And then you need to use the FMEA technique of creating a risk priority number to set your priorities, because you just don't have enough resources to look at every possible part and every possible occurrence. So look at those things that are high risk. This gives you a systematic way to evaluate the risk and devise action plans that help you reduce and minimize the risk to you and your business.